this is, I just thought this is amazing. Now it fits with the segue here is that I was just talking about our mainstream media being garbage and how they obviously are not standing up for Julian Assange. They are not going to have RFK Jr. on their airwaves much standing up for Julian Assange. They don't cover Julian Assange almost at all anymore, even as they continue to torture him. Meanwhile, the United States has the temerity, the gonads to claim that the U.S. empire gives a shit about journalists imprisoned in Russia, right? There's currently, I think, an American journalist imprisoned in Russia, and the U.S. is like, how dare you release it? And yeah, okay, that's true. All journalists should be released, but you can't say that shit as long as you have Julian Assange in prison. You can't, no one is listening to you pretending that you are serious when you've had Julian Assange in prison for 10 goddamn years. You can't walk out and go, we care about freedom of press. We want these. But no, you don't. No, you don't. Even slightly. So it undermines everything that the U.S. says anytime they try and stand up for a journalist. Now, the only times they stand up for journalists are when it harms a country that they're at odds with for one reason or another. Then they'll stand up for journalists, and that is the only time that they will stand up for journalists. They only stood up for Jamal Khashoggi, who Saudi Arabia chopped up and threw into a fire pit. They only stood up for him for about 10 minutes because Saudi Arabia is an ally of ours, but also, sorry for so many ball references, but has us by the balls because they are the core, the bottom of the pyramid of how the petrodollar works. So if they were to turn against us, that would be the end of that. Anyway, that's the segue. How much our media sucks. And I loved this chart because it says a lot about our media. It says so much about our media. So now I don't know how well you can see it, but because the writing is rather small, and for those of you on the podcast, I'll explain it. Anyway, it's a bar graph, but on the left side shows the actual causes of deaths of Americans. Now, the latest, I guess they had numbers, was 2016. So this is 2016, but this is the causes of death of Americans, with the largest colored areas being the top cause of death, and that's the amount. So heart disease and cancer are pretty close. Heart disease 30%, cancer 29.5%. And so they have the largest colored blocks there. Now on the right side is a bar that shows the mainstream media, specifically the New York Times, in the same year and how much they covered these things. Now you'd think some of the largest causes of deaths of Americans should be heavily covered by our media. But the only one that even gets close to being covered the amount that it's actually causing death is cancer, which is still less. Cancer gets 13.5% of New York Times coverage. Now, this is not coverage in general. This is coverage of various causes of death. So 100% would be all the coverage of causes of death by the New York Times. But cancer is the only one that's even close to being relative in the world of like almost rational reality. Heart disease gets almost nothing, 2.5% of New York Times coverage. Actually, stroke is almost on par. Strokes causes 5% of deaths and has 5% of New York Times coverage. But homicide, so various types of murder, gets 22.8% of New York Times coverage. And homicide actually as a cause of death is so tiny, they couldn't even write the word on it on the bar graph. Homicide causes 0.9% of American death, a tiny, negligible amount. Now, another one that is way out of proportion is terrorism was covered by the New York Times, like as in domestic terrorism, so as in the cause of death for Americans, was covered 35.6% of all of their cause of death coverage by the New York Times, 35%, over 35%. Terrorism actually causing death in America is so tiny they couldn't even fit the color on the bar graph. They just had to put a little asterisk underneath the bar graph that says terrorism less than 0.01% of deaths of Americans. So the New York Times covers terrorism a whopping over a third of all cause of death coverage by the New York Times. And this is really pretty common with mainstream media. So it's pretty the same for other mainstream media outlets. But a third of all New York Times cause of death coverage is terrorism, even though terrorism is so tiny, it's basically non-existent. I mean, when was the last time you met someone who was terrorized? When was the last time you met someone who was even in the area of terrorism? Now, terrorism is, I think they're separating terrorism from, from mass shootings. I'm assuming they're putting mass shootings into the area of homicide, because terrorism has a specific definition of like trying to create a very specific political point. Now, I suppose you could put some mass shootings into that category, but mass shootings, the number of Americans they kill, I mean, so it's weird. Mass shootings are insane. The number of in America is truly out of control. It's like over one a day. So it's madness. But the number of Americans killed by a mass shooting is still a relative nothing on the list of what kills Americans. So anyway, so it's not that I think people should not talk about mass shootings. Mass shootings are a major problem in this country. However, in terms of actual number dead, it is tiny compared to heart disease, cancer, road accidents. Someone dies on the road about every 30 seconds. In fact, I just covered a 100-car pileup a second ago. I mean, I've often said that if they covered someone dying in a car crash in America the same way they cover death by terrorism or death by a mass shooting, like if every time someone died in a car accident in America, it was national news, no one would drive again. We would all just sit home. Maybe we'd occasionally take a pogo stick to the store. Like, very rarely you'd be like, I'm going to risk it. I'm going to put on my roller skates and head on out, because we would all be so horrified. And it's similar to like burglary, burglaries where someone comes in like a ski mask and they break your windows and they take your stereo and threaten you with a gun. If we see those on all the ads, right, for the home security systems, we see this kind of ads constantly. If we saw that amount of coverage of death by car crash, then again, no one would ever let a loved one drive a car again. But because we're fine with people dying by car crash, I mean, honestly, how many of you, feel free to throw it in the comments thread if you want, how many of you have family members who died in a car crash? Like, I have at least one or two. And then in terms of friends, I have probably 5 more, or 4 or 5 more. And so it's like, we all have people in our lives who die in car crashes, and yet it's really not a discussion. It's really not like we act like it's, I mean, honestly, we act like terrorism is a bigger problem in America when terrorism is essentially a non-problem in America. But this is the way our media works, right? Our media does not give you truth. Our media is not based on truth. It doesn't bring you truth. It brings you a false view of reality that in general doesn't get down to the actual core issues, but also gets us all hyped up about things that are not legitimate issues. So someone said, "Don't get in a car with Lee." I didn't say I didn't say, I didn't say they died in my car crashes. I haven't even had. I never had a, fingers crossed. Knock on wood, whatever you say. I haven't even had a car crash in my life. Uh, but yeah, knock on wood came from knock on the cross with Jesus. That's like the origins of knock on wood, which is weird because why would you want good luck to knock on the thing that executed another guy? Another guy who, although I'm both not religious and not Christian, um, if you read what he actually talked about, a lot of it was kind of like taking care of people and not doing the debt thing and not having usury, and it was kind of like be good to people. And so they ignore all of that, of course, nowadays. But why would you knock on the thing that we used to execute that guy? That's gonna give you good luck. Knock on dynamite. I hope it doesn't happen to me.